One of the most intriguing aspects of the lead up to The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom's release was speculating how the game would handle the series' famous dungeons in the wake of the backlash to its predecessor's decision to abandon them. The Divine Beasts were widely panned by fans of traditional Zelda dungeons, and in a shocking turn of events, Nintendo seemed to listen to fan feedback because dungeons made their return in Tears of the Kingdom. However, as exciting as it was for dungeons to make their return, would they be able to live up to the series' high-quality standard? That's the question I'll try to answer in this video as we look at each of Tears of the Kingdom's dungeons to examine their quality and eventually determine which is best and which is worst. Thank you so much for watching, and welcome to every Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom dungeon ranked. The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild was disappointing in a lot of ways, but perhaps its biggest misstep was the decision to move away from the series' signature dungeons. The Divine Beasts were unique and certainly had a lot of potential, but they never captured what made dungeons and the Legend of Zelda franchise so special. It's the reason why I was so excited when dungeons were announced to be returning in Tears of the Kingdom, because I felt that most of my complaints towards the new open world format of Zelda could be overlooked with their inclusion. They were the biggest missing ingredient in Breath of the Wild, and my excitement around their return in Tears of the Kingdom is perhaps at the core of why this version of the Water Temple is my least favorite dungeon in the game. I could not have been more let down than I was by this sorry excuse for a dungeon, and it may very well be the worst trial in the entire Zelda franchise. Tears of the Kingdom's Water Temple is too short, too easy, and too underwhelming given the build up to it with Sidon that it feels like we're only playing the first section of a larger dungeon that doesn't exist. Much like the Divine Beasts from Breath of the Wild, there are only a few terminals that you must activate, in this case water wheels, and none of them pose any sort of real challenge. While I have no issue with any of the puzzles themselves, it's the fact that the dungeon goes right to the boss fight after completing them that highlights how simple and basic they are. The most interesting of the water wheel puzzles involves transporting a ball to a higher altitude island with the help of a water bubble, but again, it's a fairly straightforward process that feels like an appetizer to the real puzzles you would get with your entree if it existed. Once again, my mind is blown that they wouldn't feel comfortable designing intricate and difficult dungeons, considering that unlike other Zelda titles, you never have to actually interact with them. The fact that the Water Temple is optional at all should have given them free rein to go crazy with all sorts of different ideas and concepts, yet it feels like they hardly experimented with any new ideas at all. I suppose being in low gravity is cool and a first, but honestly all it does is make the dungeon even easier than it already is, as you can be less precise with your platforming, less cautious of your stamina, and less aware of your surroundings because you have more time to react in battle. Personally, I want dungeons to ramp up the difficulty, not make things easier, and the Water Temple fails in that regard with its lack of both puzzle complexity and enemy diversity. For all of the faults of the Divine Beasts, I can at least give them credit for trying to do something different, even if they wound up falling short of my expectations, but the Water Temple just feels lazy. It lacks the kind of spectacle that made the Divine Beast so intriguing, and the concept for its layout is as boring as you can find throughout the Zelda franchise. Being able to see nearly every part of the temple from the moment you enter it strips it of the intrigue that made even the Divine Beast fun to explore at first, and it's a far cry from the types of labyrinth-like structures you'd find in games like Ocarina of Time or Twilight Princess. I hate that it is so open with only one hidden room underneath the central platform, and nothing is inspiring about this place even if it does have a personalized setting and aesthetic. Genuinely, I can't imagine this being anyone's favorite dungeon in Tears of the Kingdom, let alone the larger Zelda franchise when there are so many better options to choose from. There's no mystery, no challenge, no fun dungeon item or gimmick to speak of, and Sidon's ability that you gain as a reward for completing the temple is my least favorite of Tears of the Kingdom's champions' abilities. Similarly, Muk is my least favorite of the boss battles in Tears of the Kingdom, and has to be one of the most pathetic dungeon bosses in the series overall. This trial needed something memorable, whether it be a mini-boss fight, its music track, or something else, but there's nothing that I can point to that feels iconic. To me, Tears of the Kingdom's Water Temple is the low point of 3D Zelda dungeons, and it's why it's hard to picture Nintendo ever producing a dungeon worse than this. It's not a great sign that when I think of Tears of the Kingdom's version of the Wind Temple, my mind immediately goes to the lead up to the dungeon rather than anything within it. It's rare that the events preceding a dungeon will negatively impact it, but the ascent into the sky with Tulin is such a fun, epic sequence that when you finally enter the Stormwind arc, your expectations for what's to come next are, no pun intended, sky high. Unfortunately, the Wind Temple suffers from a lot of the same issues that Vah Medoh suffered from in Breath of the Wild, and is never able to reach the heights that its lead-up would have you ready for. However, before I jump into what makes the Wind Temple one of the 10 worst dungeons in all of Zelda, I want to acknowledge the one thing it does well. Colgera is one of the most cinematic boss battles in the Zelda franchise, and while not the most challenging fight, it is incredibly memorable. It feels great to nosedive through the air and puncture one of its segments while an orchestral remix of Molgera's theme plays in the background. In my eyes, if Nintendo was going to choose to be so conservative with their dungeon designs, they should have doubled down and included more cinematic set pieces like this. Not that I would prefer that over a traditional style Zelda dungeon, of course, but I just want the developers to lean all the way into something rather than produce half-hearted attempts at what they think people want. This dungeon is full of examples of what I'm talking about, because at points it feels like they put puzzles in just so they could say the dungeon had them, rather than to test the player's skills and abilities. 5 wind tunnels need to be activated in the Wind Temple, but there might as well be 4 with how easy 2 of them are. The first can be accessed by simply attaching an object to a lever that opens the door to its location, while the second requires you to open a door atop the dungeon's highest building before floating between some lasers to land by it. I won't lie that it's cool to feel like a secret agent spy for a few seconds, but these jokes can hardly be considered puzzles and are about as simple as it gets. The Wind Temple's other puzzles are a bit more complex, but not by much, which is why this trial can easily be beaten in under 30 minutes on your first go. This should not be the case, but it feels impossible to get lost in this ship because it doesn't attempt to test your spatial awareness at all. Everything you do here feels very transactional because nothing is connected, which makes it hard to remember anything after you've had some time away from it. Without locks and keys, there is no reason to commit the layout of the dungeon to memory, or to really even pay attention to what you do or where you go, because every puzzle is independent. This is unlike, for example, the cannons from Twilight Princess's Snow Peak Ruins, which feel so ingrained in my memory because it took some real time and effort to figure out how to navigate the cannonballs to them for the first time. Had that process been easy, or had the cannons been one-off puzzles isolated from the rest of the dungeon, it would have been easy to forget them as I have many of the puzzles from other dungeons in the open world Zeldas. Between this video and my ranking of Breath of the Wild's Divine Beasts, I'm starting to sound like a broken record, but this trial is far too short, easy, and lacking in content to be considered anything other than terrible. As much as I appreciate the illusion of a threat from the cannon on the side of the Stormwing arc, this temple needed more than a handful of keys and constructs to be considered dangerous. I miss the days of entering a room and having the door lock behind me before I was forced to battle through waves of enemies to gain a reward and my freedom. The entire time I played Tears of the Kingdom's Wind Temple, I begged for some sense of tension or danger, which I never wound up getting, even in its massive, intimidating boss. All I can say at this point is that the Wind Temple makes me appreciate the quality of traditional dungeons more and more each time I play it, which is a shame considering its amazing lead-up, setting, and atmosphere. I've attempted multiple times to try and be kind to Tears of the Kingdom's Fire Temple because it shows me the potential that dungeons could have in this format, but I just can't bring myself to do it. Somehow, seeing how close this dungeon was to being good makes the reality of the trial worse, and makes me more annoyed than if it just completely sucked. There are many issues with this temple, but this feels like a good time to talk about one of Tears of the Kingdom's biggest flaws, and that's the total lack of enemy diversity within its dungeons. Despite all dungeons having 2 to 3 unique enemies, an overwhelming majority of combat encounters are going to be with some form of construct. I hate this because aside from it being absolutely boring to fight the same enemies over and over again, the constructs have zero intimidation factor and don't even feel like real enemies. They aren't creepy looking, their attacks are slow and predictable, and despite dropping useful materials, they don't even feel satisfying to kill. Slaying an artificially created robot will never feel as good as taking down a monster that feels like it's actively trying to murder you, and I can't understand why Tears of the Kingdom has so many creatures that don't find their way into the dungeons. It feels especially noticeable in the Fire Temple because there are so many areas to explore, and yet you never wind up fighting anything interesting. It would have been so refreshing to hop in a minecart and ride the rails, only to realize you were en route to a close quarters encounter with a Lionel, or better yet, an original exclusive enemy that could only be found in the Fire Temple. Instead, in an attempt to fill the massive world that Tears of the Kingdom boasts, they went in the opposite direction and made it possible to now find dungeon bosses in the overworld, which, while kind of cool, destroys their novelty and makes them feel less significant. It's a shame because more enemies and combat in general would have reinforced the Fire Temple's inhospitable nature. This is by far the most threatening environment of the trials in Tears of the Kingdom, with its various lava pools and intense heat that requires special clothing to endure, and I've always been impressed by the scale and scope of this underground facility. For all its faults, the Fire Temple nails the intimidating atmosphere that I love to see in Zelda dungeons, and I wish they had capitalized on it further with tougher and scarier enemies. Its theme and structure set it up for success, and there's no doubt in my mind that this could have been the best dungeon in an open world Zelda, but it ultimately winds up feeling more like a theme park than a dungeon because you rarely, if ever, feel under duress. Again, this issue is not exclusive to the Fire Temple, much like how this dungeon's simple puzzles are not a unique problem for the trial either. However, this is more disappointing to me than the lack of enemy diversity, if only because this felt like the perfect setting to have some longer, more complex puzzles. The Fire Temple would have been a great place to test your spatial awareness because of how its rail system connects the different buildings, but the fact that there are no locks or keys really hurts the trial a lot. Every challenge remains as an independent one-off despite the interconnectedness of the map, which feels like a big missed opportunity to make the entire temple itself feel like one big puzzle you need to solve. Though even if everything was connected, there are still only 5 puzzles to solve before you can fight the boss, which is far too few for how quickly you can solve them. Link's abilities in Tears of the Kingdom just feel too broken not to have restrictions on them, and they make completing the Fire Temple far simpler than it needs to be. For example, I heavily dislike how Link's climbing ability trivializes so much of the thought that would ordinarily go into completing the trial, because you can simply jump over the lava river rather than engage with the hydrants, and you can completely avoid the dungeon's main rail gimmick by climbing the walls. I don't like how easy it is to bypass the intended method to complete most tasks with this ability, and that's without even getting into all the different ways you can abuse Ascend, Ultra Hand, and Recall too. Restrictions can be a good thing, and I hope that as Zelda moves into the future, its developers learn from the mistakes of the Fire Temple and realize that it's okay to limit what the player can do sometimes, even in an open world environment. I've decided to place the Construct Factory and Spirit Temple second on this ranking mainly because I appreciate how original this dungeon feels. I can't think of a time in a past Zelda dungeon where your goal was to assemble several parts of what essentially amounts to the dungeon item, and wouldn't mind if this concept was explored further in future titles. I think what makes it so satisfying is that the construct you build is actually kind of fun to use because of the way it interacts with the various Zonai devices. You can run fast with the help of a fan, shoot people from a distance with a cannon, and even blast off into the air with a rocket like you're playing Super Mario Sunshine. It's fun experimenting with all the Zonai devices to see what they do to the construct, and I'm glad they made it so versatile. I think it's pretty funny that Link has his own mech now, but I actually don't find it all that useful outside of the brief time we spend with it going to and in the Spirit Temple. There are many better options for traversal while exploring the overworld, particularly when you unlock the auto-build ability, and as cool as some of the Construct Zonai adaptations are, it's also usually better to keep the versatility that Link has while in combat. Still, I enjoyed using the Construct in the fight against the Seas Construct, and felt it was one of the more fun fights in the game. While not exactly difficult, I loved the cheesiness of being locked in an electrified cage, and how the fight was basically a giant mech battle. Unfortunately, for as positive as I am towards the construct, its assembly, aka the bulk of the Construct Factory, is slightly underwhelming. I enjoyed the idea of escorting each construct piece back to a central location, but once again felt let down by the puzzles surrounding the process. While each limb depot presented different obstacles for you to overcome while maneuvering the construct parts, I found a simple solution that trivialized each section completely. In nearly all cases, it was possible to use Ultra Hand in conjunction with Recall to totally bypass most roadblocks that you came across, skipping the need to engage with any of the intended or suggested methods. Of course, you can choose to do the intended method for each if you want, but to me it's lazy level design when one simple solution will work in 4 different areas. That being said, I do admire how the Construct Factory and Spirit Temple are spread out and integrated into the depths, rather than being isolated structures like the rest of the dungeons are. I've always found it neat when Zelda dungeons interact with the overworld like Skull Woods from A Link to the Past or Turtle Rock from Link's Awakening, and this trial takes things to the next level. Now, I'm not sure I'd like it if every dungeon were this open, but it does help the Construct Factory to stand out positively and give the trial a grander scope. It was an interesting swerve to realize that the Spirit Temple wasn't another full dungeon, but rather just an extension of the Construct Factory, and I like the idea of the boss getting its own exclusive area because it makes it feel more special. Though the Fire Temple was placed in the depths, the Construct Factory felt like the dungeon that truly represented this massive new part of Tears of the Kingdom. While that isn't enough to call it great or even good, I always appreciate new concepts and ideas in a series as long-running as The Legend of Zelda is. However, for as many aspects of this area that I like, they don't compensate for the Construct Factory's lack of challenge and short length. Being as open as it winds up being is a double-edged sword when you realize that after assembling Minoru's construct, you can just build a vehicle and fly to the Spirit Temple, avoiding the waves of enemies on the path the developers intended. Maybe to some they love having that option, but I will always prefer tightly designed dungeons with more specific solutions, and it's why, despite being able to praise it for its novelty, I can't say that I truly enjoy the Construct Factory and Spirit Temple. The Lightning Temple is the best dungeon in The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom for the simple fact that I think that it has the best puzzles in the game. While light redirection puzzles are somewhat common throughout the series, they're always welcome because they tend to make good use of 3D space. You have to carefully consider the area you're in and how to position all the mirrors to direct the beam of light to where it needs to go, and it's satisfying when everything falls into place. Even if you immediately understand what the goal of the puzzle is, figuring out how you are going to light up the various switches in the Lightning Temple's central chamber is what makes this trial fun to solve, and why I have given this dungeon the top spot. While I still wish these puzzles were a bit more complex and difficult, I appreciate how they make the Lightning Temple feel a bit more connected. This has been a point of emphasis throughout this ranking because I feel it's very important that puzzles have cohesion with each other to some degree. There are already dozens upon dozens of shrines, and countless side quests and Koroks where you can get your fix of one-off puzzle solving, but what makes Zelda dungeons special is how the puzzles interact or build off of one another. The fact that you have to have some level of spatial awareness to maneuver the mirrors where they need to go, even if it's only between 1 or 2 rooms, is still preferable to every task being completely isolated from one another. Still, I have to complain about the lack of content, as there are only 4 batteries you must activate with Riju to fight against the boss, and one of them is completely disconnected from the rest. You can find that battery by simply removing a few stone blocks with Ultra Hand after you've activated the Lightning Temple's main terminal, which doesn't even qualify as a puzzle in my eyes. That means that essentially, you'll only have 3 batteries to locate, which frankly is an unacceptably low amount of content for a main dungeon. And while there is a small section at the beginning of the Lightning Temple where you escort Riju to the main terminal, nothing significant enough happens here to make up for the lack of depth in the dungeon's main concept. Fortunately, the Lightning Temple has the best boss fight in Tears of the Kingdom, which allows me to slightly overlook its lack of content. Something I absolutely love about this fight is how the first phase is the very first thing you do upon discovering the Lightning Temple, and while it's a short-lived phase, it raises the stakes for the temple in a big way. Going through the dungeon knowing what awaits you at the end is an awesome feeling that changes the dungeon's tone, but also motivates you to power through it so you can get to the inevitable rematch. It reminds me of the excitement I felt when leading up to the face-off with Argarok in Twilight Princess's City in the Sky, and though I wouldn't want this to become the norm, this is a trope I hope Zelda games use again in the future. All that said, hype alone doesn't make a fight great, but Queen Gibdo is legitimately threatening and can give you a hard time in its final phase if you don't have a good strategy to take her down. It's easy to be overwhelmed by smaller Gibdos if you don't eliminate the 4 hives in each corner of the room, but destroying these pillars is easier than it sounds. You have to have good enemy management skills to avoid getting swarmed, and while you can find reprieve in the columns of light, eventually you have to put yourself out there to deal damage to the queen. It makes for an intense and thrilling fight that is surprisingly one of my favorite 3D Zelda bosses, and the other main reason this dungeon is ranked number 1. Overall, the Lightning Temple is still a far cry from the excellent traditional Zelda dungeons the franchise was known for, and shares many of the universal issues open-world Zelda dungeons face, but it is so clearly a tier above the other Trials and Tears of the Kingdom to me, and an easy choice for the top spot on this list. Dungeons and Tears of the Kingdom definitively showed that there is potential for dungeons in an open-world Zelda format, but to me it is clear that there is a lot of work to be done before that potential can be realized. This game's temples are at best disappointing, and at worst kind of insulting, and I really hope the next 3D Zelda game can get them right. But please let me know what you think of the Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom's dungeons down below. Was I too harsh on them, or were you similarly let down by them? Drop a comment with your thoughts or a future ranked video that you'd like to see, and as always, if you enjoyed the video, please give it a like, subscribe, and turn notifications on to be alerted whenever I release a new video. Thanks for watching.